The supreme, profound, and wondrous Dharma is difficult to encounter, even in millions of eons. Now that we have the chance to hear and receive it, may we realize the Tathagata's true meaning. In order to liberate all sentient beings, please give rise to the supreme bodhicitta. Let's continue. We're studying Chandrakirti's Entering the Middle Way. Today we pick up where we left off at page 103. Let's begin from there. We have already introduced the information of the Bodhisattva path from the first Bhumi up to the sixth. Within the sixth Bhumi, what we are taking up now is the refutation of all phenomena as inherently existent. In other words, there is no arising from self and no arising from other. Right now we are in the middle of refuting arising from other, and this refutation itself has two levels, a general one and a more specific one. The more specific level also takes up the world's everyday notion of arising from other, and when we investigate the ultimate truth, the worldly people's view does not contradict our position. The text lays this out in three parts: a brief presentation, an extensive explanation, and a summary of its qualities, 3 sections in all. So today we come to the summary, whether our view is inconsistent with worldly perceptions or not. This part also has 3 sections. First, when we investigate with the ultimate truth, the principle unobstructed by all worldly hindrances. Second, when we examine things as having a nature of their own, within the world's own conventional sense, the principle obstructed by all worldly hindrances. So there are these 2 sides. Take the first, when we investigate ultimate truth, the principle unobstructed by all worldly hindrances. This has 2 parts. First, it is unreasonable to take the worldly cognition as valid. Here, an invalid cognition cannot undermine the valid cognition. That is to say, the invalid cognition cannot hinder the valid cognition. That is mainly what we will address. Next, the first part. It is unreasonable to take the worldly cognition as valid. We are teaching this principle. If the worldly opinion were held to be a valid cognition, worldly beings can perceive true reality. What would be the purpose of the noble ones? And what use would there be in following the noble path at all? So it is equally unreasonable to treat ignorant beings as the standard of valid knowing. When we study the middle way, we should all understand this. Why should we study the middle way? Mainly because in the second turning of the wheel of Dharma by Shakyamuni Buddha, he discovered that from form all the way up to the wisdom that knows all are all emptiness. But this establishing of them as emptiness was taught from the side of scripture and reasoning. How should our inference work? How do we establish this by logic reasoning? In the sutras this is not clearly laid out. So the originator of the middle way, the Buddha, had already proclaimed the Prajnaparamita teachings. Within that it was Nagarjuna who first systematized and opened up this path, and then Chandrakirti carried it forward. Now when Chandrakirti carried it forward, some learned masters hold that in India there was no division into consequentialist and autonomist. This includes Master Bhuton and others. Some also hold that there should indeed be such a division. For example, Master Bhavika and Master Santaraksita, they belong to the autonomous school. As for Chandrakirti and Master Buddhapalita are consequentialists. In fact, according to the view of Mipam Rinpoche, the consequentialist school's view is the highest. The Beacon of Certainty also says that the Indian Master Chandrakirti and the Tibetan Rongzom Pandita established that all phenomena are emptiness and purity with one voice. The reason is that Chandrakirti established the principles of the middle way with great thoroughness. So in the course of our study we can discover this for ourselves. If we read the Prajnaparamita Sutras every day or recite the Diamond Sutra every day, then the merit is definitely immense. But how exactly all phenomena are empty is not made explicit there. Here, on the other hand, why all phenomena are emptiness, this principle is established point by point. In the course of establishing it, some parts may be only dimly understood. This may well happen. Now what we are addressing below is that worldly people's objections can't contradict our position on arising from other. What this means is what we said in the preceding sessions. Worldly people rest within their own view. They affirm everything they perceive. Everyone, including farmers, affirms it. So in that case, when we say there is no arising from other, it seems we have drawn objection from the world. They say that this is not reasonable, but here we say, especially when we establish the true nature of all phenomena, what worldly people perceive is not correct. That is mainly what we establish here. Now, when we establish it, the first point is the worldly people's view is not a valid cognition. If the worldly people's view is held to be a valid cognition, that is not reasonable. Here, valid cognition and invalid cognition are specialized terms in Buddhist logic and the middle way. If a person does not understand them now, then they may not understand them their whole life. So a valid cognition is what is correct. What is most correct is called a valid cognition. An invalid cognition is what is not correct, what is mistaken. We should all understand this. As for this valid cognition, in the treasury of reasoning, when valid and invalid cognition are taught, a valid cognition sometimes has the sense of measuring and is used as a verb. Sometimes it seems to be a kind of unit of measure, but the valid cognition spoken of here is like when we say a person of valid cognition, it means the most correct kind of person. A person who is perfect and complete without a single fault is called a person of valid cognition. So here means that the worldly person is not valid cognition. Is the worldly person a valid cognition or not? This is the principle. If the worldly person were held to be a valid cognition, the worldly person would see the truth. And what use would the noble ones be? What he says here is that when we examine the true meaning, if we were to treat the seeing, hearing, and knowing of worldly people as the most ultimate form of valid cognition, then the worldly person would already see reality as it truly is. And if that were the case, what would be the point of the noble ones? If worldly person seeing were real, then within that true reality, the views that the worldly person accepts, and what is gained through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body, if all of them were real, then what use would the noble ones be? So these noble ones would be of no use to employ a rhetorical question. If the perceptions which were obtained through the worldly person's eye, ear, nose, and tongue were all correct, then within this world, for example, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the Shravakas and Pratika Buddhas, all of them would be of no use. Why would it be of no use? Because if the seeing of ordinary people were correct, then what use would their perceptions be? What use would there be in cultivating the noble path? If the noble ones were of no use, we cultivate the noble path in order to attain the fruition of the noble ones, through hearing, contemplation, and practice, through keeping the precepts and so on. What use would there be in cultivating the noble path in this way? It would be of no use, because at most you would attain the fruition of a worldly person. So in that case, the ascetic discipline you have undergone or the noble states you have attained would amount to nothing. For example, the Buddha turned the wheel of Dharma 3 times. The Buddha has a state far higher than us worldly people, so the Buddha's turning of the wheel of Dharma is meaningful. If he had done none of that and were exactly the same as us, then there would be no need to study. In the Samadhiraja Sutra it also says, the eye, ear, and nose are not valid cognition. The tongue, body, and mind are not either. If these were valid cognition, whom would the noble path will benefit? If our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind were all valid cognition, then the noble path would be of no use, but in reality they are not valid cognition. The idea that seeing is believing is just a saying of worldly people. It is no valid cognition and nothing real. Finally it says, the foolish are taken as valid cognition. Worldly beings have their wisdom eye obscured by ignorance. What these foolish worldly people perceive cannot be a valid cognition. If you take it to be a valid cognition, that is highly unreasonable, because the object that they apprehend and their own subject that apprehends it, in fact, differ greatly from the true nature. Inevitably, there exist distinctions among the true nature of all phenomena. For this very reason, the Buddha also says, be careful not to trust your mind cannot be trusted. This quotation comes from the Sutra of 42 sections, and what it's telling us is to be careful, and our minds are fundamentally unreliable. What is spoken of here is that when we examine the true meaning, worldly beings will claim your position that arising from other is mistaken. We can see it ourselves, such is their claim. But ordinary people are simply not in a position to make that kind of claim. For example, take a worldly court that governs the present life, and a worldly person serving as a judge. He is simply not qualified for it. At such a time, a fool serving as the arbiter is definitely not reasonable. So here we should all understand that according to teachings of the middle way, when the middle way truly ascertains the true nature of all phenomena, it cannot be obstructed by foolish worldly people, though they do not accept it. Even if they do not, when we examine by reasoning, what ordinary people perceive cannot undermine it at all. Earlier yesterday, did we not state that the affliction of cataracts lies within the person themselves, and this perception cannot influence persons without cataracts? So, although worldly people admit arising from other, but their notion of arising from other is quite unsophisticated. It is a very loose and surface level idea. If we examine it carefully, we cannot find its true nature. So within our world there are some kinds of arising that have their own laws, and there are some that do not exist even on the conventional level. Why did we earlier speak of false conventional truth and real conventional truth? Take real conventional truth, for example. One may claim that a seed can arise a sprout, or subsequent conceptual thought arises from prior conceptual thought. On the conventional level, the real conventional truth are reasonable. Then, as for false conventional truth, a cause arises from what is not its cause. For example, if you say a green sprout arises from a stone, this too is unreasonable. Recently, we have also been saying that consciousness is generated by the brain. This is not even reasonable on the real conventional truth level. Why is it not reasonable? The education that many of us received is that our consciousness is in fact a product of the brain. This is a point we must examine carefully. Up to now, including Harvard University in the United States and many scholars and medical scientists, they argue unambiguously that thus far there exists no solid evidential foundation to prove that consciousness is generated by the brain. If a basis had really been found, there would have to be a law and a principle behind it. We all know what a law is. It must always be so. Just like the law of universal gravitation, it has a definite regularity, and scientists should be able to establish this regularity firmly through data and empirical evidence. Now, scientists hold that if today we drink a very good beverage, or I smell something with cloves, a special fragrant scent, or I am at a crossroad and hear the roar of cars, and at that moment this response arises. In fact, scientists cannot find it even now. If they had truly understood the outer world, including how black holes occur and how the atom bomb is made, these chains of cause and effect, they are highly expert in material phenomena. Just look at modern weapon systems, or the way satellites can pinpoint a target from space with extraordinary precision. In the material world, science has become remarkably exact. But when it comes to consciousness, scientists remain rather baffled to this day. There exists no instrument whatsoever to examine consciousness. Without such instruments, the principle and mechanism behind how the brain supposedly produces consciousness simply cannot be pinned down. We should be able to ask scientists about this in the future. Let us see what the scientists say. If consciousness is generated by the brain, then what is that law like? A law is something that those who study physics should all be clear about. A law has its own very specific regularity. If we're talking about a law of cause and effect, there is a law that without the cause the effect does not arise, an objective regularity. This is certainly needed, or its principle ABC. How is this principle derived? It must be so. But as for this, including within each cell of our brain, if you examine them, the cause that produces consciousness simply cannot be found. And if it cannot be found, then you cannot treat the two as producer and produced. At the very least, you cannot treat them as producer and produced. So many later scientists, including during our years of schooling, I barely encountered this concept back in middle school. At Teachers College, we studied dialectical materialism. There was a teacher at that time, and the two of us would go back and forth on this day after day. I simply could not accept the materialist view. I hadn't studied Buddhist logic yet at that time, so I couldn't articulate exactly why, but on the level of basic reasoning, I just refused to concede the point. The mind is certainly not generated by the brain. He insisted that it is generated by the brain. I asked how exactly does it generate it. He could not tell. Then I said the mind is not that. He asked that why it is not. When he told me to explain, I could not say either. Sometimes it goes like this, but truly speaking, this is a very important viewpoint within Buddhism. Nowadays, when reflecting on consciousness, that flickers momentarily before disappearing completely. Most people conceive of it as a transient phenomenon within human beings, comparable to the operation of a machine or a summer insect that flickers momentarily before disappearing completely. This is a key point, especially for us Buddhists. We may still need to do more research in this area. Furthermore, we can likewise examine relevant philosophical treatises at a later stage. What it means is that the consequentialists say that arising from other does not exist, and if arising from other does not exist, then is there any worldly contradiction? There is none at all. There will be no worldly obstacles in this entire process, absolutely none whatsoever. For the question of whether such inherent arising truly exists, this is exactly the field where the Prasangika consequentialists possess unparalleled expertise. For instance, someone who cannot tell precious gems apart or knows nothing of antiques, his talk will be nonsense. Consider the analogy of a colorblind individual rendering judgments amid those thoroughly versed in all colors. He speaks out of blind ignorance, and the situation is identical. In fact, appearances of this kind can occur within our world as well, so we need not be afraid at all. Even if worldly people accept arising from other, at first it sounds really right. Worldly people really do accept such and such. But in fact, can this worldly theory refute our viewpoint very precisely and sharply? The viewpoint of the middle way cannot be refuted. We often speak of the consequentialists and the autonomists. Some people have asked me before, which school am I actually from? I said, you belong to the most powerful school of the middle way, and that is the consequentialist school. Think about it. Do you want the most powerful or not? Oh, I want the most powerful, they said. Then you are a consequentialist, because as for the consequentialist school, they can only draw out unwanted consequences from opponents' viewpoint. No one comes to argue against the consequentialists themselves, nor is there any way to overturn their viewpoint by reasoning. This is what we call the consequentialist school. What we intend to clarify here is that when it comes to the ultimate truth of the middle way, the statements of ordinary beings in fact possess no authority. Or rather, every claim they make is wholly invalid. It cannot refute our genuine viewpoint at all. Next we explain, thus an invalid cognition cannot undermine a valid one. We don't need to recite the Tibetan, right? All worldly cognition is invalid cognition. And so when examining the ultimate truth, there is no contradiction with the worldly cognition, because we have already explained before that when we examine the real meaning, worldly people are not valid cognition. Everything worldly, including their seeing, hearing, feeling, and perceiving, should not be taken as valid cognition. So when Chandrakirti says thus, when examining the real, what he means is, when we turn our investigation toward ultimate truth, this is Master Fazun's rendering of thus examining the real. Moreover, when Buddhist scriptures and treatises are translated, one cannot help but use language that is somewhat archaic. But as for this archaic style now, worldly people today are especially busy. On top of that, they want the kind that is especially easy to grasp. Fragmented pieces of information swirl all around us, and no one is willing to think carefully. Sometimes I think to myself, this verse is so hard to understand. Master Fazun's translation of the auto commentary is hard to understand, and then the original text of the auto commentary, Chandrakirti's auto commentary, is also very hard to understand. So with this much that is hard to understand, and the modern people are both busy and lazy, how could they take it up? Apart from a few people, not so many people are willing to learn these teachings. In modern times, countless people regard themselves as uncomplicated souls and grow intoxicated by this disjointed worldly realm. Such a state is their deepest longing. So when we study the middle way and the Buddhist logic, it is still something great, something remarkable. Now in this kind of time, I keep thinking these principles of the middle way are very good, yet many of them employ rather archaic wording, and people are unwilling to contemplate. For some texts, a translation had to be done that way at the time, which is actually quite remarkable. I was truly remarkable for his time that Master Fazun produced this translation in such a fashion. We shouldn't refute it later on because it is truly impressive. However, people today are particularly lazy, and they especially prefer the simplest words. They don't want to use their brains or think too hard, and they just want to understand it directly. Even something as simple as a WeChat or Weibo post. When I post something online or share something occasionally, I try to keep it simple. I try my best to make it easy to understand, otherwise I fear that many people won't want to process it. If it's a bit archaic or a bit wordy, they won't have time to read it. If it's a bit archaic, they won't focus on it. So sometimes, although our current theories of the middle way are excellent and its logic is extremely sharp, leaving no loopholes for anyone, which is how it should be, but if this line of reasoning is not smoothed out well, then many people will get confused. Even some who might consider themselves to be teaching the middle way, but it turns out to be quite vague when they speak. They haven't even mastered the most fundamental principles themselves, so they seem to say a lot, but are actually quite ignorant in reality. This phenomenon does exist, so I think sometimes there's no other way. For now it is what it is. Therefore, when translating his commentary this time, we tried our best to translate it into easily understandable language, otherwise his auto-commentary would be even harder to grasp. So everything in the world is not valid cognition, right? Worldly perceptions and experiences are not valid cognitions. Therefore, the ultimate truth perceived by noble beings, or the ultimate wisdom we use to observe, determine, and abide during this process, the various worldly objections and absurd consequences thrown at you, will not actually cause any harm. They will not cause the slightest harm. Why is that? Because worldly people have a kind of disease of ignorance constantly obscuring them. Just as we discussed yesterday, if a person with eye disease says that your statement is unreasonable, it doesn't create any fault. So sometimes sentient beings have ignorance chronically disturbing their minds. After being disturbed, our minds are not very clear. We grasp at a non-existent self as a self, and grasp at empty phenomena as non-empty, and so forth. Therefore, for ordinary people, they get very angry if you say they are mentally ill, replying, "You are the one who is mentally ill, and I am not crazy." But a lot of times, many of us ordinary beings can be considered mentally ill. There is nothing wrong with admitting it. If someone says, "My eyes are diseased," indeed, my eyes are diseased. Everything we see is actually impermanent. But I cannot see impermanence. I see everything as permanent. I perceive things that are fundamentally impure as pure. So my eyes do have a disease, and my mind and nerves are also afflicted. Ordinary beings certainly have all kinds of afflictions. So during our examination of the ultimate truth, how can someone with a mental illness find fault with you? Generally speaking, it's impossible. So there's a real distinction within our cognition too. And here's what I mean. Worldly cognition, for example, is completely obscured by ignorance. Someone with such obscurations of ignorance regarding the ultimate truth and supramundane matters, or the principles of completely pure true reality, will not be able to see the truth. Thus there is no harm done. How is there no harm? For example, the wisdom of noble beings is like space. What they say is completely boundless and perfectly reasonable. When ordinary fools argue with it, or worldly people raise objections against it, it is like trying to cut space with a weapon. Cutting space is impossible. No matter how many weapons I have, I cannot cut space. Similarly, the various worldly objections will not cause any harm to the genuine true reality of all phenomena. For instance, when we say that all phenomena are free from the four extremes and eight fabrications, and have no source of arising, no self-arising, no arising from other, worldly people might argue, it exists, I see it. But in reality, it's just that they don't understand. Indeed, in our real life today, some people don't understand the principles of the middle way, and don't understand that all phenomena are empty. They insist things exist, they are not empty. If everything is empty, how could I see form phenomena as existing? And so on. This kind of reasoning will not cause any harm to us. Therefore, here we should note that especially in entering the middle way, the boundary between the ultimate truth and relative truth is extremely clear. Their domains are clearly separated, defining what belongs to the sphere of noble beings and what belongs to the sphere of ordinary beings. So will the sphere of ordinary beings harm the sphere of noble beings? Absolutely not. The ultimate truth is the truest reality and the most definitive. So will this most definitive teaching be destroyed by what ordinary beings see, like things arising and passing away? No, it won't be destroyed. However, it is very likely that you might misunderstand it. If you do not understand it, you might think that is the case, but in reality this is just our own wrong view. Therefore it says here that regarding any defining characteristics we haven't seen, such as not seeing self-arising or other arising, if worldly people say they have seen them, then their visual perception is not a valid Cognition. In the context of examining the ultimate truth, worldly people are not valid cognitions. Therefore, when examining the ultimate truth, worldly objections and worldly doubts are normal, but they will not be harmful. Thus, those of us who study the middle way should eventually understand that the true reality of all phenomena is indeed like this, even if others don't mention it. When one reaches a certain level of listening and contemplating, it's like someone drinking water. They alone know whether it's cold or warm. You will understand it yourself. So at this point, for those around us who have studied the middle way and emptiness relatively well, although we may not currently have completely eradicated our afflictions and grasping, we are completely clear on the theory. Sometimes we see people around us really struggling, even to the point of thinking about ending their life or clinging so tightly to something that it's consuming them. In moments like that, we naturally feel deep compassion for them. If they had taken refuge earlier, or read these Dharma texts earlier, perhaps they wouldn't end up in such a state today. As for ourselves, some people often feel that they are extremely fortunate to have encountered the Mahayana teachings. Otherwise, in such a complex world, we might have already left this world or been unable to face reality. When dealing with many real-world problems, with particularly stubborn grasping, the stronger the grasping is, the more likely one is to break down when they can't get what they want. Such phenomena do exist. So I think here everything in the world is not a valid cognition. Actually, when we examine the ultimate truth, the world is not a valid cognition. Therefore, during this examination, worldly objections cannot pose any harm. That is the main point. Then comes the second aspect. In some mundane context, there are indeed worldly objections which we must acknowledge. In the context of worldly matters, worldly objections do exist. So what does this mean? If you use what the world itself accepts and turn around and use it to deny worldly reality, that's what we call a worldly objection. If we use what is commonly accepted in the world and speak from the perspective of worldly consensus, what does worldly consensus mean? It refers to what people in the world mutually accept. There is a set of conventional laws and rules, such as eating, walking, and talking, which are perfectly normal forms of communication and ordinary activities and everyday actions for everyone. These are the conventionally accepted designations. And within these conventionally accepted designations, there are certain worldly rules that if you fail to acknowledge, it will cause harm. For instance, people in the world often say, my family had a son this year, I planted some crops today, or I made this much money today. I had some pretty good stocks initially, but then they fell, or my vase was snatched by someone else. During such ordinary conversations at times like this, if some people do not respect conventional terms and you speak from a different perspective, saying it is impossible for you to have a son because nothing truly arises and everything is empty. Planting crops is also impossible since crops are unarisen, and your vase couldn't have been snatched since the vase is fundamentally empty, and so on. If one jumps to another perspective to talk like this, then this incurs a worldly objection. Because in the world as we also see today, some people cannot clearly distinguish between conventional and ultimate truths, because all phenomena do genuinely exist on the conventional level. Cause and effect also exist, past and future lives exist, and parents and children exist as well. They truly exist, and this is the concrete, real, conventional truth. It is present. If you jump to another domain and say, there is nothing to be killed, nothing to be eaten, and nothing to be done, then this is like the wild Chan mentioned in Chan Buddhism. Things become inverted, and it becomes entirely like lying with one's eyes wide open, completely denying the laws of real life. These laws of real life are also acknowledged by the Prasangika Madhyamaka school. We should be like those who have truly realized emptiness, such as Master Chandrakirti of the Prasangika Madhyamaka school, who is a classic example. If we were to ask him how he is feeling after waking up in the morning and if he is in good health, he wouldn't reply that the body cannot be established. Nowadays, some people often act like this. After learning a little bit of the middle way, they apply it to everything. For some students abroad who have learnt a bit of the Dodchen, direct pointing out instructions, since they generally start from the top down, actually the way some Rinpoches and masters truly guide them still needs a little bit of adjustment, because people should progress from the bottom up. Just as in our education we start from lower grades, then middle grades, and then move to higher grades, Buddhist study is the same. If one starts with a PhD and then works their way down without laying any foundation, they might eventually develop wrong views and leave, which is quite troublesome. So they all especially prefer certain high teachings like receiving empowerments and reaching the highest states. The questions they ask are also all along these lines about how luminosity works and what happens upon realization. But in reality, when they encounter the slightest disturbance, they suffer immensely. Since basic logic and fundamental suffering have not been resolved at all, this approach is actually unreasonable. When we Buddhists engage in listening and contemplating, whether studying the middle way or Dzogchen, we must build a solid foundation. If the foundation is not well laid and one destroys even conventional reality, by doing so makes it very difficult to establish one's practice. So when we were discussing earlier about what constitutes a worldly objection. A worldly objection simply means that the world has its worldly laws, and you cannot use middle way concepts or other terms to start denying these worldly laws. If you do, you will incur a worldly objection. Therefore, in the future, when we meet ordinary people and they say to us, "I lost my bag today, my bicycle is missing, or my train ticket has expired," you shouldn't say, "What train ticket?" It is fundamentally empty and nothing can be established. This train ticket is like the son of a barren woman, or the hair of a tortoise and horn of a rabbit, which cannot be established in the ultimate truth, or within one's intrinsic awareness there is absolutely nothing. Generally speaking, not to mention ourselves, even past masters who truly realize the middle way, like Mipam Rinpoche, would not destroy these conventional laws in their speech. Mipam Rinpoche also mentioned in other middle way treatises that destroying conventional reality and refuting phenomena is completely absent in the middle way school. The middle way school never refutes conventional appearances at all. Conventional appearances cannot be refuted anyway, because they are only transcended through spiritual practice. The existence of these appearances is not harmful. When the great master Tilopa gave teachings to Naropa back then, they also said that appearances do not need to be refuted. It is the grasping at them that is harmful. Therefore, we must now, on the one hand, properly maintain worldly laws and not negate them. If we understand a little bit and start denying the infallible law of cause and effect in the world, that is not the view of the middle way. As for the view of the middle way, it refutes within the genuine ultimate truth, as will be discussed later from what perspective self-arising and other arising are refuted. But in real life, that good is rewarded with good and evil with evil, and certain basic principle absolutely cannot be refuted. If one refutes these, we might become a laughingstock in the world. Because just hearing some principles about non-arising and emptiness and using them to refute all conditions and laws of the present world is definitely unreasonable. Therefore, it says here, if one uses conventionally accepted principles to refute conventional meaning, then this incurs a worldly objection. Living in the world, you must not misunderstand. If everything is entirely nihilism and everything is just empty, that is also unreasonable. Therefore, the middle way actually determines in its view that all phenomena are empty and does not accept even a sesame seeds or a hair's breadth of true existence. There can be no inherently existent things. However, within appearances nothing is denied. Not denying this is also necessary. Thus, when we study the middle way especially, we must not deny cause and effect. Developing more and more faith in infallible cause and effect is a sign that your study might be relatively successful. Next, it discusses that within the conventional truth, there is no inherently established other arising, so it does not contradict worldly phenomena. Actually, there is no inherent other arising on the conventional level. The worldly beings only place male seed within a woman's womb and says, "I begot this child," or thinks that "I planted this tree." Thus, even on the conventional level, there is no arising from other. Here, because it was said earlier that worldly people accept other arising, the following explains that within conventional terms, worldly people do not actually accept true other arising. This other arising is actually not truly accepted, even in the world. How is it not accepted? He uses a worldly analogy here. In fact, worldly people are quite simple. Although you said earlier that worldly people accept other arising, this worldly notion of other is just like when we frequently chat and speak of self and other. It is still quite vague. It is not carefully analyzed as it is in middle way theory. What is their kind of other? Here he gives a worldly analogy. For example, in the world, how is otherizing not accepted on the conventional level? Actually, for worldly people, as they go about their daily lives through their impure actions, there are things like sperm, which acts as the initial cause and combines with an egg. Because of such a tiny male seed, a child is later born. He then says, "This is my son." He doesn't say, "This son is other and I am other and we are inherently distinct entities." He doesn't say it like that. It is just that there was a very small causal condition previously, and this condition is later called my son. That is how it is designated. Actually, the other day some people also asked how peanuts grow or how sunflower seeds grow from a sunflower, but in fact this is fundamentally the same as the analogy used here. The worldly relationship between father and son is also just based on a very, very tiny previous cause, where out of hundreds of millions of sperm, the fastest, tiny one, enters into the union of regenerative fluids and then becomes the cause of birth. Just like a peanut today inside its seed, there is a very small thing called an embryo. It is extremely tiny and its entire outer shell is not the cause. Those who have studied biology should be clear about this. It seems as if its entire outer shell is the cause, but in reality only a tiny speck becomes its true seed. Therefore, the arising of anything, including plants, happens in this way, and the births of humans are also like this. Therefore, worldly people do not accept inherent other arising. Furthermore, after the child is born, he says, "This is my son." It seems as though the relationship between me and my son is a relationship of I and mine, but he doesn't say it is me and other. When he says in the world, "This is my son," the phrase "my son" feels as if he is closely connected to me, continuously passing down my lineage. It is designated with such a concept. Secondly, if he had planted a tree in a past spring or planted a tiny seed to grow a tree, then later, because of this course, he says, "This is the tree I planted." He doesn't say that the tree seed and I are completely distinct entities. And when he says, "This is my tree, the tree I planted," it feels as if there is a relationship of self arising between us. He never mentions other arising. So judging from this language, actually, how should I put it? Worldly people do not accept other arising either. It doesn't exist in their perception. Perceptually, it feels more like oneness, a feeling of a single entity. But in reality, it doesn't mean they think cause and effect are completely distinct entities. We will also discuss this later. It seems conceptually cause and effect carry a sense of oneness, but it is also not that worldly people establish a truly existent relationship of oneness or distinct entities between themselves and their sons. They don't hold such detailed concepts. Therefore, the worldly concept of cause and effect is a very subtle relationship. Worldly people simply don't have the time or the concept to observe this relationship closely, nor can they find such profound causal conditions. Thus, on the conventional level at most, we just speak of the father-son relationship, but as to the exact nature of this relationship, and what kind of producer and produced relationship it is, this is not found even in our worldly treatises, including in our current theories. Whether the causes and conditions between father and son cease or do not cease, such analysis is probably impossible. So worldly people have no way to establish this either. Next, explaining the merits of such refutation. Because the sprout is not an inherent other which exists independently of the seed is not destroyed when the sprout exists. Because they do not have inherent oneness, one cannot say the seed exists when the sprout exists. If these are not explained, they probably don't seem very easy to understand, right? They all look the same. So it says here that cause and effect are neither one entity nor distinct entities. For cause and effect, we acknowledge whether they are one entity or distinct entities. Both are very difficult to establish. What does this mean? Because the sprout is not an inherent other which exists independently of the seed, means that this sprout, this green sprout, is not a distinct entity separate from the seed. If it were truly a distinct entity, it would be like a yak and an elephant. A yak and an elephant have no relationship. For example, if a yak dies, an elephant isn't necessarily born. So it is not a completely distinct entity. The sprout is not a genuine distinct entity, separate from the seed. If it were a distinct entity, it would fall into the extreme of nihilism. So the seed is not destroyed when the sprout exists. Therefore, at the time of the sprout, the continuity of the seed is not destroyed. This way it avoids the extreme of nihilism. Because in the middle way we pay close attention to neither eternal nor annihilated. If it falls into the extreme of nihilism, cause and effect cannot be established. If it falls into the extreme of eternalism, they cannot be established either. Therefore, regarding the relationship between the sprout and the seed, whether others ask or you yourself, we also occasionally ask those people, what do you say is the relationship between the sprout and the seed? One entity or distinct entities? If it is separate from the sprout, the seed cannot be said to be a completely distinct entity either. If they are not distinct entities, at the time of the sprout, the continuity of the seed is not broken. If it is not broken, it shows that it hasn't ceased to exist. It hasn't fallen into the extreme of nihilism. So it still makes sense because they do not have oneness, because the sprout and the seed are not of one nature. If they were of one nature, if they were a single entity, then the shape of the sprout and the shape of the seed would be exactly the same due to being a single entity. Their colors and properties would be identical too, but this cannot be established because the two are not one entity. For this reason, you cannot say the seed exists at the time of the sprout. When the green sprout is present, it is impossible to say the seed is still there. One cannot say the seed exists. If that were the case, it would become the extreme of eternalism. Exactly because the two are not one entity. Due to them not being one entity, the seed cannot be said to exist at the time of the sprout. For this reason, it avoids the extreme of eternalism. In that case, the ultimate meaning is that what exactly is the relationship between the sprout and the seed? It is not that of distinct entities. If they were distinct entities, it would fall into the extreme of nihilism. The sprout and the seed are not identical as one entity. If they were one entity, it would fall into the extreme of eternalism. Because if the sprout at the time of the seed never changed and they were one entity, if it never changed, then the sprout would forever remain exactly like the seed, because the two are one entity. Or you could say the seed would forever be identical in entity with the sprout. This would result in falling into the extremes of eternalism and nihilism, making our causality unreasonable. From this reasoning, in reality, regarding cause and effect, you cannot say they are one entity, nor can you say they are distinct entities. They are neither one nor different. So when we say neither one nor different, what exactly is this saying? It is actually referring to a dependent origination that is free from all extremes of eternalism and nihilism, or a dependent origination free from oneness and distinct entities. This is what we call dependent origination, and what does not exist cannot arise. When this is present, that exists. From the arising of this, that arises. When this is absent, that does not exist. This is an extremely profound mystery, and all laws of cause and effect are contained within it. Therefore, when we study the middle way, we must definitely have such an understanding. If we try to express it in words, asking whether cause and effect are one entity or distinct entities, we will never find a reasonable answer. Just as we said earlier, if the sprout and the seed were completely distinct entities, they would have absolutely no relationship, so this seed should not produce a sprout. Just like a yak and an elephant, if you say they are one entity, then how could one produce itself? It's impossible. So this is also forever impossible. Does that mean the two have no relationship? They do have a relationship. What kind? The dependent origination relationship of, if this is absent, that does not arise. It is neither eternal nor annihilated, neither one nor different. At the very beginning of the root stanzas of the middle way, it talks about being free from the four extremes and 8 fabrications. Actually, this explains the laws of all phenomena. So why is it said that the Buddha is truly remarkable? No one else has ever explained it this way. Even now, people still struggle immensely with this. Many of them ponder whether cause and effect actually make contact or not. If they make contact, it's impossible to make contact, because if the former has not ceased, it cannot produce the subsequent result. If it is said that they do not make contact, then just like between the eastern and western mountains, with such a huge empty space in between, how could they interact with each other? They are also deeply troubled by this issue, but in reality we say that as long as the causes and conditions are fully complete, this law of all phenomena naturally forms on its own. If a phenomena arises from conditions, it is neither identical to nor different from its cause. I believe this is stated in the root stanzas of the middle way. Therefore, this is called the true reality, which is neither annihilated nor eternal. It means that all phenomena arise from causes and conditions, but these causes and conditions are neither one nor different. They are neither one entity nor distinct entities. Therefore, this is called ultimate reality. This is called infallible dependent origination. It is neither eternal nor annihilated. This point is extremely important. So during our learning process, some of the most fundamental principles should be thoroughly understood. The Middle Way school affirms the two truths are neither a single entity nor separate ones. nor separate ones. Everyone should be clear about this. Next, refuting the assertion that there is inherent arising in the conventional truth. This is divided into two parts. There is no inherent arising in the conventional truth and the merits of such refutation. It is divided into two aspects, and the first one is divided into the actual refutation and dispelling objections. First, the actual refutation is divided into 3 points. These are what we often refer to as the three great absurd consequences of the Prasangika Madhyamaka. Refuting by the consequence that the meditative equipoise of a noble being would become the cause for destroying existent phenomena. Refuting by the consequence that conventional truths would have to withstand logical analysis, and refuting by the consequence that the ultimate cognition would be unable to refute arising. It refutes through these three aspects. The first point states that the meditative equipoise of a noble being would absurdly become the cause for the destruction of existent phenomena. We use this to refute. The root verse says, if you assert that things arise from conditions are inherent entities, then by realizing the emptiness would destroy all phenomena. Emptiness would then be the cause of destroying phenomena, but this is unreasonable, hence all phenomena have no inherent nature. Here it presents what we often call the three great absurd consequences the Prasangika Madhyamaka school uses to refute lower schools. Some people believe these three great absurd consequences are aimed at refuting the mind-only school. Masters like the omniscient Gorampa, Changchupa, and many other great masters say that these three absurd consequences were raised by the Prasangika school against the mind-only school. On the other hand, Master Jechongkapa and Mipam Rinpoche state that they are directed at the Svatantrika school. However, applying it to the Svatantrika school is actually perfectly reasonable. Because if it were directed only at the mind-only school, there is still the Svatantrika school in between. So with the Svatantrika school caught in the middle, it is much like the conflict between Iran and the United States. Mediating between the two sides proves extremely difficult. But if this is directed at the Svatantrika school, then the mind-only school is also included in it. So if even the Svatantrika school has flaws, it goes without saying for the mind-only school. If we look at the auto-commentary, it seems as though he is directing this at the mind-only school. Taken literally, it does appear to be aimed at the mind-only school, but applying it to the mind-only school is not contradictory either. Therefore, this absurd consequence should be directed at the Svatantrika school. So if we apply this consequence to the Svatantrika school, why do we direct it at them? Everyone should know this basic principle. When Mipam Rinpoche teaches the commentary on the ornament of the middle way, he also explains why the Prasangika Madhyamaka school refutes the Svatantrika Madhyamaka school. Actually, the Svatantrika Madhyamaka school basically shares the same ultimate meaning with the Prasangika school. However, when making provisional assertions, they keep the two truths separated. But in the view of the Prasangika Madhyamaka school, there is nothing to separate. Whether it is the ultimate truth or the relative truth, everything is completely refuted. The Svatantrika Madhyamaka school says that within the emptiness of inherent nature, or within the ultimate reality, all phenomena are not arising and not ceasing, everything is empty. But on the conventional level, arising with inherent characteristics does exist. They separate these two quite clearly. In that case, if these phenomena truly exist with inherent characteristics on the conventional level, then when a noble being enters fundamental meditative equipoise, these phenomena cease to exist. In that case, the noble being's fundamental meditative equipoise makes all this self-arising, other arising, or inherently existent phenomena disappear. Because they disappear, the noble being's fundamental meditative equipoise becomes the cause for destroying all these phenomena, just like a hammer shattering a vase. This is unreasonable, so it is refuted from this angle. Of course, regarding the principles of this refutation, there is a lot more to be discussed, but whether it is explained or not, the essence remains the same. If interpreted literally, whether the Prasangika school addresses the Svatantrika school or the mind-only school, they say if you assert that inherent characteristics arise from conditions, for instance, that pillars, vases, or feeling, perception, and mental formations, all these phenomena exist with inherent characteristics, and on the conventional level they arise depending on their respective causes and conditions, and truly exist. If you hold this view that all phenomena truly exist conventionally without being empty, then when a noble being enters the state of emptiness, these phenomena are no longer present. If they originally existed but now do not. This is a form of negation. That is to say, the noble being's fundamental meditative equipoise has destroyed the existence of these phenomena, just like a vase being destroyed by a hammer. So if that were true, the noble being abiding in emptiness, this state or this kind of wisdom would have become the cause for destroying conventional phenomena. If the mind-only school asserts the existence of a self-aware, self-knowing consciousness, then it is ultimately destroyed because they assert an inherently existent, the other dependent nature, or for other schools like the Vaibhashika school, who say if any phenomena exists but ceases to exist during the noble being's meditative equipoise, then the meditative wisdom has become the cause for destroying phenomena. But this is unreasonable. Naturally, this is definitely unreasonable. When we analyze this logically, such a claim is certainly unreasonable. A noble being's fundamental meditative equipoise cannot be asserted as the cause for destroying phenomena. Therefore, the conventional phenomena you assert, or these relative phenomena, all lack inherent nature. If you accept that they lack inherent nature, then it is reasonable. But if you assert that there is an inherent nature, that is unreasonable. Regardless of the perspective, I believe Khenpo mentions in his commentary that if in our daily views we claim that a pillar is not empty and is only empty of its true existence, such a view has indirectly fallen into this absurd consequence, because if any phenomenon is not empty, but you say it is empty of something else, then ultimately in the noble being's fundamental meditative equipoise there are no such distinctions between empty and not empty. Everything is completely empty. So it is better from the very beginning to establish that all phenomena are entirely empty. This is the correct way. Otherwise, if we designate a certain phenomenon as empty and say another is not empty, or if you grasp at mere emptiness, this ultimately leads to a quite significant flaw. The great sage taught emptiness to relinquish all views. If one then holds the view of mere emptiness, they are incurable by all the Buddhas. I think this is from the root stanzas of the Middle Way. The teachings on emptiness given by the great sage, the Buddha, are primarily intended to help us abandon all the various views. But if some people grasp at the view of emptiness and don't let go, clinging to mere emptiness, then even the Buddha cannot teach them. This wrong view is very serious. So whether we practice Chan Buddhism or the Middle Way, if we merely indulge in emptiness, in fact such people have also been rebuked by the Prasangika Madhyamaka school. They cannot bypass this absurd consequence either. Furthermore, if on the conventional level there is a phenomenon that is stubbornly indestructible, or if it exists in a solid and impenetrable manner, the same applies. So what is the main point being determined here? When we establish the view of the Middle Way for absolutely any phenomenon, up to all phenomenon, including the Buddha's omniscient wisdom, ultimately their essence is emptiness, and their nature is luminosity. If one masters this principle, it is exactly what our original teacher Shakyamuni Buddha meant by the profound and vast teachings. This is it. Therefore, when we are learning about emptiness, we should understand it in this way. This is the better approach. All right, we will stop here.
Bandara